So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speg and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Mr. Jonathan Burdick. Now, Mr. Burdick is a public school teacher at the Union City area middle and high school. After graduating from Edinburgh University in 2009 with a degree in secondary education, he continued his studies, earning a master's in education and curriculum and instruction at Edinburgh, and also earned a master's of arts in history at Slippery Rock University. He is also a contributing writer to the Erie Reader and founder of the public history project Rust and Dirt. He resides in Mill Creek with his wife and 2 children. When I asked him for a description of this program, when I asked him to be a part of this conversation to talk about history in the now and the present, he wrote back to me, "History isn't simply learning what happened in the past, but how what happened affected individuals." That's the first line of his description that he sent to me after I had reached out. And he added, "Understanding our shared collective history helps us contextualize the present, from current events to our own lives." So here we are today, to discuss history and its role in our understanding of it. What drew him to history as a discipline, how he himself teaches it and writes about it, and why and how he launched a public history project. Folks, since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you do have a question, just leave it in the comment section below and we'll work our way through it. If you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this event, please do still send us your questions. We're going to do our best to get them along to Mr. Burdick as we can. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit our website at jeserie.org and like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Mr. Jonathan Burdick, thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Definitely. Thank you for having me, Ben.
So as I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of your work at the Erie Reader, and that's how I got to know you. But then I got to really know the other project that you were working on, something before the Reader that's really exciting. I like tuning into it. I love your posts, and you're incredibly great on Twitter. I love that from a public history standpoint. Let's talk about Rust and Dirt. I'd love to hear how you got started, and then I'd love to hear why. Why start a public history project? So how'd you get started, and why are you doing it?
So it's got a bit of a weird origin story in it. Probably never would have happened had it not been for something absolutely awful that happened to me. I was in my 7th year of teaching out at Union City, and I lost my history teaching position. And fortunately, I had a backup math certification where I was able to bump into that. But I guess to back up, what initially happened was I was out in the hospital with my wife. She was having our 2nd son. And I got an email from a student, a senior of mine. And that student basically said, "Mr. Burdick, your US history class isn't in the scheduling book for next year." And I was just like, "Oh, that's interesting." So, I thank her for emailing me and letting me know. And I kind of wait around hoping that somebody was going to say something, but I get back to school about a week later, and it turns out that they were planning on cutting the U.S. history course that I'd been teaching. So some of you probably will remember this. It was all over. Go Erie covered it, Your Erie covered it, Erie News Now covered it, but they were going to cut 2 of our high school social studies positions, one including mine, and then another popular teacher that teaches 10th grade history. And students started organizing and protesting. This is where it made the news. 200 kids did a walkout one day, and they picketed the admin building all day. The following day at 9 a.m., about 100 students stood up in their classes and walked out, and they did a sit-in out in the hallways. The school board meetings were absolutely packed. I spoke at it. Tons of my freshmen of mine were speaking at these school board meetings that were standing room only. And then they did the cuts anyway. So I lost my position it was my dream job, teaching US history. And I ended up getting bumped down to 7th and 8th grade math. And I appreciate math. I was okay at it, but I mean, there's some teachers that are they have the skill set to teach whatever, it doesn't matter, and that's certainly not me. My skill set is definitely more in the humanities. So I was really, really depressed that summer for obvious reasons. I was happy I was still getting a paycheck, but I just knew I needed to keep tapping into that particular part of my brain, that history and sort of like the creative arts did. So I just kind of one day was just thought I would come up with something on my own where I could keep doing history. And I have a particular interest in local history and people becoming aware of local history, because that gives you a sense of place and it helps you, understand where it is that, we're more than just Oliver Hazard Perry and the Battle of Lake Erie, So I told my wife and a handful of friends about it. And then I just started following anybody that used the Erie PA hashtag. I just followed 1,000 people, and slowly it started to take off. Within a month, Nick Warren of the Erie Reader had noticed it, and he reached out to me and he was like, "Hey dude, do you want to write something for the Reader?" And that was my first story, where I wrote about Leon Ray Livingston, the king of the hobos. And he made my first one a cover story, which rocked me, totally blew my mind. And yeah, I guess the rest, that it's grown from there. I'm not really sure what it is exactly, Rust and Dirt. I call it a public history project. Public history is something that's important to me as a teacher. I try to teach history in a way that, to my students, that is more than just names and dates, and it's simple and easy to understand narratives and accessible, and more than just presidents and governors and mayors and stuff. And that's kind of been my goal with Rust and Dirt from the beginning, is show you what Erie's history has been like for regular everyday people for the past 200 years.
So you can totally dodge this question if you want to, but I've got to ask it because it's such an attractive name. I really like that. But of all the words and that you could have chosen, you chose two: Rust and Dirt. I guess three if you're counting the conjunction there. But you chose that. Why the title Rust and Dirt for this?
We're known as the Rust Belt, so that's where I got that. I live up here in Erie. Actually, I live right on Grandview, so my side is actually Mill Creek, and I look at my neighbors across the street, and they're Erie. So, we're the Rust Belt up here. But I grew up on a dirt road. I grew up outside of Cambridge Springs near Cosawago, where my neighbors were pastures and cows. So, we're such a strange area. We have this blue collar Rust Belt city, and then you go anywhere outside of it, and it's just rural America. For my wife, she's a Pittsburgher, and she went to Gannon, and she said they just never went beyond Summit. They'd go up to that Summit area, and everything else seemed like this strange other world, and her and other Gannon students that weren't from this area just would never venture that far.
And they're really missing out. There's so much here. It's a really unique. It's unique in some regards of how quickly you can get from an urban center out into pastures and vineyards,
right,
and a waterfront. All of that in our area.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Jonathan, for me, it was the Civil War with Mrs. Brandt in third grade. That's when I fell in love with history. For you, somebody who said, earlier you remarked that you've got the skill set to teach, to teach the humanities more than, per se math. For you, when did you fall in love with history as a discipline?
So there's not a single defining moment in my mind. It's more of a accumulation of things. Like I said, I grew up way out in the middle of nowhere on a dirt road. I had one friend that lived out there near me. Literally, that was it. And he was a mile away. So I spent just a lot of time reading and watching movies. This was back when we only had 3 channels. We didn't get satellite till I was 11 or 12 years old. So I think boredom is initially what attracted me to history. We had an old school encyclopedia set, the real encyclopedia sets, and I would just sit there and I would just read the encyclopedia for fun. I don't know why, but I would just sit there and read it. And, watching movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark, of course, like most kids born in the 80s, I was obsessed with that. And I wanted to know everything about the history and the mythology that was connected to that. Loved movies like Gettysburg and Glory, Spartacus, all the Ben-Hur, all those old movies. Watching MASH with my dad. Roots. I remember Roots really affecting me because that was LeVar Burton. That was my Reading Rainbow guy, and I saw these horrible things happening to LeVar Burton, and I wanted to know why. And a couple other things I would say that really pushed me towards history, where I took 2 important DC trips in 5th and 6th grade, field trips, and absolutely rocked my mind being in the Smithsonian's. And then again, a couple years later in 9th grade, when 9/11 happened, I was sitting in my 9th grade history class with Mr. Kleffel was his name, and he left the TVs on, even though they told us to turn them off. And he really walked us through and contextualized over that rest of the year, like what was going on, why this was happening. And I'd say all those different things have really drawn me towards just history over the years. But even then, like I never planned on becoming a history teacher. When I graduated high school, that was not my initial major. I was not going to study history or education at all.
So I absolutely, I have the same memory of 9/11. I ended up in a second period European history class, and I remember the intention of leaving them on. And there was, at least in my high school, which I'm not originally from Erie, but a small high school in southwestern rural Pennsylvania, there were debates between the teachers of turn it off and move on with the day and leave it on, and to be able to watch history in the making in real time. And I remember, just what a formidable moment, or formational moment that was. So you went to college not thinking history was it for you. What changed it when you got there, when you got to Edinburgh?
So initially as a senior, I wanted to do everything. So, I mean, I applied to a flight school at Embry-Riddle in Florida. I applied to a film school out in Los Angeles. I applied to like creative writing. I mean, I applied all over the place to all these different things. I ended up actually initially settling. I started at a school down in Florida, actually, my freshman year, with a criminology sociology double major. And I mean, I loved my criminology and sociology classes that I took that year. But as you get a little older and you think what a field is going to be like compared to what you see it's going to be, and then you look at what your life is going to be like. And I was like, I'm not sure if this is really what I want to do. So I ultimately transferred to Edinburgh my sophomore year, and I decided to become a teacher, probably partially because my brother was a teacher at the time down in North Carolina. My then girlfriend at the time was going to be a teacher, and it just seemed like it made sense. And history or English were the only two I was interested in, and I just settled on history.
So I want to get to one of the pieces you've recently written for the Erie Reader: Racism's History, Anti-Racism's Future, and Where Erie Goes from Here. American Injustices from George Washington to George Floyd. That's the headline and subhead of that piece. I don't want to give it all away, and I want to encourage folks to go over to eriereader.com and give that a read, because I think that it's something to read, sit with. It's a little longer, but it's something so good that you're going to want to focus on and give it some time. But I want to talk about it. We'd be remiss if we didn't, because you start with a confession of sorts. You were out of high school before you had learned that George Washington was an enslaver, and you admit that might surprise some folks. It's not that the information isn't out there, as you write. Tell us about that in terms of the line that struck me is that the truth is that the story of the United States that is often taught, that is often portrayed in children's books and in movies, the story that many of us grew up with, paints an incomplete portrayal of the American story. So tell us about coming to that reckoning of George Washington as the fuller man that you came to know him as, and then the importance of writing this story today and to be able to walk people through their more complete history.
So first, I guess, to address the George Washington question, I don't know how I didn't know that. And I was definitely embarrassed when I found that out. And not only it wasn't like he owned like 2 or 3, like we're talking like 300 enslaved people. And I don't like blame my teachers, because I really enjoyed my history classes at Cambridge. I would probably blame a lot of the outdated curriculum that was being used, or the things that were often glossed over. I'd love to look back at the old textbooks that I, learned with and see, was it mentioned? Was it just like something that was just briefly looked at? But for whatever the case, I missed that. I would say when I got to college, immediately my college history teachers tried to veer us away from what they call great man history. That history is just a collection of your George Washingtons and your Abraham Lincolns and even your Martin Luther King Jr.'s, right? That they may be a symbol for certain things that happened, but there are so many other things around them that made those situations possible. So one of the most influential books I read in college was Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And like it's a really flawed book. I can recognize that now. But for somebody that grew up on great man history, to read something that was bottom to top history rather than top to bottom, it absolutely blew my mind. And it started to make me think about what would have one of George Washington's enslaved people thought of the Declaration of Independence, or what would a Native American thought of the Constitution, or what would a woman have thought of the Constitution at the time, or anything like westward expansion or manifest destiny. Like, we always focus on Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, took them out there, and I don't have to reiterate the story, but what we saw as westward expansion to others might have seemed as an encroachment or an invasion, or certainly just not the same perspective that we had. So that's kind of where that line came from, and I wrote that confession purposely for that reason. I wrote that story, if you read it, you can tell I wrote that story very angry. I try not to write angry, but it was the day after the protest in Erie that turned bad. And I'd been down there. I left before nightfall, so I wasn't there when it turned bad, but I watched the whole thing on live stream. And I knew it was going to change the way that people were talking about it, and people that were looking to vilify the movement and what they were trying to accomplish. And I saw it immediately the next day, and I didn't even ask Nick at that point if he wanted me to write something on it. I just sat at my keyboard and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And then I asked him, and he was like, yeah, you can do that. So that's where that came from.
So writing angry, something you try to avoid, but I think while a reader might sense that and might feel that passion in some of it, it's sensible in how it walks a reader through that. And I think it's something we can't gloss over, is the mythology versus the history, in terms of mythologizing people like Washington and people like Jefferson, and people that have a critical role in the country's origin, but are not perfect people. They themselves are imperfect. And how do you as an historian go about in today's class teaching that, and moving away from perhaps mythology or the great men form of history, as you were talking about? How do you fix that? How are we fixing it? How are we better ensuring that the whole history is told?
Yeah, I guess the idea is that you still teach these people, because George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton or whoever, they're all, of course, important to the founding of the United States and what we call our collective shared history. But if you're only teaching what they wrote and what they saw and what they viewed, you're not giving the full picture. If you leave out the fact that Thomas Jefferson enslaved people also, as he wrote the Declaration of Independence, you're missing a key portion of the founding of our nation, and it's the great sin and the great hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence. We can view this as a perfect document in a way, but not everybody else is necessarily going to see the Declaration as a perfect document based on their perspective. So if you teach these people still, but you teach around them also. You don't just teach what they were saying and what they were doing, but what others were saying and doing at the time. And it's not, you don't judge them by 21st century values, but you can look at, like, I remember people always saying, well, these were men of their time. There were hundreds of people outspoken, thousands, millions of people outspoken against slavery, least of all the people who were enslaved themselves. It's a complicated thing to deal with, but I know Lin-Manuel, for instance, Miranda, has recently been taking flack for Hamilton's portrayal of slavery, where it's just mentioned a couple of times and they kind of gloss over that. And he totally acknowledges it. Like, instead of getting defensive, he's like, yeah, guys, you're right. Let's talk about this. Or even same with, the name of the Jefferson Educational Society. I'm going to assume, I certainly don't want to speak for a Black historian, but probably a Black historian wouldn't name an organization after Jefferson. Maybe, but I would imagine not. Um, so, you know, it's just important to talk about these things, not try to sugarcoat them. They're hard conversations to have, but that's how you know they're worth having.
I think that's such an important note, and something to hold on to in this moment, and something that, sometimes we need to evaluate just how we've been telling the story and tell it differently, and not to necessarily take people out of history. I don't necessarily view a monument coming down meaning we're never going to hear about that person again, but we're
Right.
telling history in a different way. And we have versions of the history we could go back and compile. I mean, one of the things known about Jefferson was how meticulous he was in his note keeping. And so we have his records of the names of all of the slaves that he had owned. And we have an ability to now talk about that and to unpack that with different scholars and say, what is that place? And how do we move through that with a person that gave us Jeffersonian education? And that's rooted in our mission, not the person per se, but where do we go from here? And how do we tell that story? And how do we do that? Not trying to just turn a blind eye to it and ignore it. And we find that in the moment things can sometimes change, and that's one of the things that you address in this piece as well, is looking at the public perception of Martin Luther King Jr. at the time compared to how we look at him now. And you had included him in your list of great men when it comes to great men history. Talk to us about the reality of America and how Martin Luther King Jr. was viewed at the time, and how that might actually surprise some of your readers.
Yeah, to just the one point, I included King in the great men because oftentimes the civil rights movement is sort of simplified as there were two people. There was Malcolm X and there was Martin Luther King Jr. And then they got some civil rights legislation passed, and racism was over. Of course, the King was just a leader of a particular movement. And he was just one of many intersecting movements during the civil rights movement. And even within the SCLC, his organization, I mean, he was, yes, the figurehead, but, the ones making the sacrifices were the young men and women who were putting themselves on the line every day, potentially with the potential of being killed many times, being killed. And those are the names we often forget, and then it gets boiled down just to King. But yeah, I mean, King was a radical. People forget that. He was widely despised by white Americans. If you look at it's either the Gallup or the Pew polls from the time, it was something like 63% of Americans viewed him negatively the year before his death. And this is after the Nobel Prize. This is after Selma. Um, he wasn't really lionized until after he died. And part of that was he was a safe figure to do it. You don't lionize Malcolm X or the Black Power movement, which they sometimes saw as sort of aggressive, and they like the idea of this nonviolent civil disobedience. But they also distort what exactly that was in the process as well. But yeah, I mean, the FBI targeted him. J. Edgar Hoover targeted him. They wiretapped him. You can read the letter. I linked to it if you read the online version of the last story I wrote. You can read the letter where the FBI was pretending to be a black activist, telling King that he needs to essentially kill himself. King had a couple of affairs. Well, he wasn't a perfect person. He did have some affairs, and they knew that from wiretapping, and they tried to ruin his family life with that. His wife, in many ways, made, so many sacrifices for this movement. And I think they really they were essentially telling King, if you don't stop, you're going to end up like Medgar Evers, who was shot in his driveway with his wife and kids in the house. And you can read all this now. The FBI's declassified it all. Get on the FBI website and you can find all the documents on Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, I think that that to me is such an important part of our understanding of our history, is the ability to own up to that is who we were at the time, and not try to hide that from readers or obscure that from readers of, I guess, bearing full the story, so that people can understand what happened, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but learn from it, as a lesson of how do we be better than we were then, as a people. I don't, like I said, I don't want to give that whole piece away because I want to encourage people to head over to eriereader.com to read that. Another one, though, that I want to touch on, because I want to encourage people to read this one as well, is your feature, Thinly Shrouded Racism. You actually touched upon, and this might be one of the things that not a lot of people know about, is the activity of the Ku Klux Klan in Erie and white supremacy in Erie. Pennsylvania was clearly part of the North, was part of the Union, but yet here we have a history. Tell me what some of your responses were like from writing that piece. Fan mail, hate mail, what was that like initially? And then I want to talk about the role of dialogue.
So I would say that was definitely the piece where I got the most shocked responses. People that said they had no idea, that they had, not that they didn't know that the KKK may not have been somewhat active here, but when they see that, just west of Waldameer, on Bear Farm there, they have 2,000 people showing up to this KKK event. I think it definitely was pretty surprising for people. I'm not sure about page hits, but I do know that was my most shared story on social media. So clearly it resonated with some people. And most of the criticism actually I got was more like, one that kind of stuck with me was that they felt that I had a little bit of a too rosy ending to it. And I kind of see what they mean by that. Like, I certainly didn't mean to suggest at the end of it that like racism was over, but uh, I think my follow-up piece to that kind of showed that that's not what I meant either. But no, I mean, it was mostly positive response, just people showing shock, people asking exactly where Bear Farm was. If you go down the Rust and Dirt Facebook, I posted a map of where that Bear Farm was. And the road is still named Bear Road and Bear Beach. They just have a couple private cottages there. So yeah, that's been the response so far.
So as a public historian, somebody who writes about this and records it, puts out features like this, and we all have your words at our disposal, and yet it's one-on-one response back and forth. In today's hyperactive climate of content, and the accessibility of today's writer, of somebody being able to email you right after they've read a piece and say, these are my thoughts and I want to share them with you. What's the role in dialogue for you as a writer after you've written something that is public, and now the public responds, but just mostly privately to you, but then conversely also on platforms like Twitter or like Facebook, and is publicly engaging one-on-one with you in an open, wide space? What is that like today with the closed response and the open responses?
I mean, I engage right now. I'm really just read, in the Erie market. I can't imagine somebody who has a national platform. I read the criticism, and sometimes it stresses me out, and I think about writers that are read all over, and I'm just like, oh my God, how do they deal with that? And my guess is they just tune it out. They just don't read any of that stuff. But no, I read it and I engage with it. If anybody has questions or criticism, I generally will respond to it and try to get something productive out of it. Part of being doing a public history project is the point is you're trying to engage the public. So I'm not going to defer from that responsibility. And mostly it's overwhelming positive. The last one that I wrote where I wrote angry, I got a lot of negative feedback to that. That I didn't bother responding to though, because frankly, I didn't care what anybody thought about that one.
Maybe that's the passion, maybe that's shining through again. I want to call people to go and take a look at that one. Another
Yeah.
piece, you talk about a connection between Selma and Erie's hammermill paper, something that maybe we're in Erie more familiar with the latter because of its placement to us and our understanding as a post-industrial now manufacturing town. But the significance of that, tell us about that connection between Selma and Erie's hammermill paper plant.
So maybe 7 or 8 months ago, I first discovered that, and I was absolutely blown away because I've been teaching Selma, the story of Selma, since my first year teaching in 2010, and somehow I'd never heard the Erie connection to it. But for those that aren't familiar and haven't read the story, hammermill paper, which is a staple of Erie manufacturing for quite some time, in the 1960s was looking to expand, and they had started to expand into a couple different areas of Pennsylvania, but they wanted to go into the deep South for a couple of reasons. One is definitely they didn't want a unionized plant, and then the other is implied by people that were writing during the time was that they were looking to hire Black workers because it was cheaper labor. So that's at least what some of the papers reported and some of the criticism. So what eventually happens is, on the very day that King is arrested for the first time down in Selma, the exact day that he is sitting there in a jail cell, Hammer Mill executives had gone down to, I think they weren't in Selma. I think they were in the Capitol. And they were standing with George Wallace, the extremely racist, segregation forever governor of Alabama. And they were like praising him and thanking him for his agreement to help them open up this Selma plant. So this coincides with the Selma campaign for voting rights. And John Lewis, who is currently a representative, currently suffering from pancreatic cancer, but he's still legislating. He almost immediately calls for a boycott of Hammer Mill products. And eventually, after the Selma campaign's over, and Hammer Mill hasn't backed down or changed their tune in any way, these students from Oberlin College in Ohio and SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a couple other organizations all planned to do a boycott right here in Erie outside of the Hammer Mill headquarters. And they did it during the week of the shareholders meetings too, which was obviously deliberate. So SCLC reaches out, King's organization, and they decide to send one of King's right-hand men, C.T. Vivian. C.T. Vivian had been down there through the whole Selma campaign. He was once called the greatest preacher that ever lived by King. And he actually comes and helps lead negotiations with a couple of the college students with the Hammer Mill executives. And they came to some sort of agreement. But it is strange because Hammer Mill's no longer here, but the plant down in Selma still operates down there. So there's obviously more to the story, but that's the cliff notes.
And we'd encourage people to head over to eriereader.com to read that. And looking at Selma, looking at what you're writing about now, the moment, I keep hearing it from various folks that I run into that now feels different than before. The 1980s, the 1968 even, and so on and so forth back, that there's something different. But it seems that when it comes to having a conversation about race in America, and I know I'm doing an awful thing asking an historian to talk about the present without having had time to study it, is now different. Do you think? And if so, why, when it comes to having the conversation right now about race in America?
I mean, this is definitely different. In some ways, it's the same old story as, it's been since Rodney King in 92 or before that, or Ferguson in 2014 and 15. But this is different. And, there's a lot of things going on at the same time that sort of are setting the stage for, I don't even know what yet, but, you have the Donald Trump presidency. You have what happened in Charlottesville with white nationalists and neo-Nazis and David Duke chanting, "We will not be replaced," and, holding their tiki torches and trying to defend Confederate statues. And then you have, of course, the pandemic, which has us all just shook up and confused and unsure. And then you had the video, and it's not the first video of a Black person or a Black man being killed by police. I'm thinking about the one, I think it was Walter Scott, who, that video of him running away and getting shot in the back, like, people were still defending the cop for that one. There's something about this one, though. When it started, it was like, even my conservative friends were posting like, this is an outrage. And it was one of the first times I had seen that happen. Now it's since been politicized and I think kind of veered off and split with the protests. But I think there's a cultural shift happening. I think there's an awakening of young people. Not Black people have lived with this reality forever, but I think a lot of white, liberal, conservative, moderate people are starting to look at this and saying something's got to change. Now, will that lead to policy changes? I have no idea. I think it will lead to more people, young people, getting involved in politics, though, and running campaigns. And I think it's changing our generation's psyche. That's for sure. I don't know where we're going to end up, though, but hopefully.
I think you're spot on. With the pandemic, clearly making things different right now, but just the idea that this video does feel different. The 8 minutes and 46 seconds of watching the entire video, the entirety of that, there is something different. And to have your voice is critical in studying this and moving through it, not just for the public, but for your students. And so now back to teaching history. What do you enjoy teaching the most when it comes to being in the classroom? What lesson do you look forward to every year? And this year might be different, acknowledging the impact of COVID-19 and what teaching is going to look like. We can get into that. I know that's a lot to unpack, but just for you, year in and year out, what's been the favorite lesson that you have? And then is that the same for writing? Do you enjoy writing about that subject, researching that subject, or are those different?
So I guess first I didn't say I do have my history teaching job back. I guess I didn't clarify that earlier. They took away that U.S. history course and there was no U.S. history in the high school, but we got a new superintendent and a new assistant superintendent or curriculum director, and the school board approved to bring those classes back. So I am fortunate. I used to teach 1865, so Reconstruction to the present. It was so hard to try to just get all that in a single semester. I'm fortunate now I start at World War II and teach to the present. So first I'll tell you the lesson I miss the most. Now that I teach from 1939-ish to today, I miss teaching a lot of the labor history of the late 1800s and early 1900s. If you don't know the strike at Homestead Steel Mill down in Pittsburgh, Google that. I used to teach that. We would actually do, with the kids, we'd do a simulation where some of them were skilled laborers, some of them were unskilled laborers, some of them were moles working for Carnegie and Frick and trying to like create infighting between them. And I would just be there as like this wise retired worker that was just there to guide them if they had any questions. And then I would actually have them, the unionized workers, trying to convince the non-unionized workers to join the strike. So I really, really miss that lesson. Nowadays, though, I guess I don't really have a favorite. As I teach every year or every class, I kind of just, if I see that the students are really like engaging in one particular topic, then I just adapt my unit to sort of go with the flow of what they're most interested in. I would say what students are most interested in, they love the civil rights unit for sure. I think that when we learn about like Emmett Till and George Stinney and Medgar Evers, and we look at that lynching map together that shows all the known lynchings, like that really just like blows their mind and engages them. And then of course they love the 60s, anything related with Vietnam, hippies, Woodstock. So my favorite thing to teach is what they enjoy, and those tend to be those things.
That's an awesome answer, and I think your students would be appreciative of that. I think we're appreciative of that. When it comes to writing, you write a lot about Erie. Is there one particular thing that you enjoy digging into the most when it comes to Erie history?
I just like it all. I like everything. That's the cool thing about Nick and Matt and Adam and Brian over at the Reader. Like they literally have never told me no to something that I've wanted to write about. And for me, that's amazing because I'm learning as I'm writing these things. And yeah, there's not anything in particular that I just like learning everything there is to know. And there's so much that there's left to uncover. And I just enjoy that process. I like seeing an old newspaper article or seeing an old document or seeing something on a old census. And then I love the process of like, it's almost like detective work as you're piecing together all these different things and documents and things that the person might have said and comparing it to, does that really match up with what really happened? And that's really what I like. I love the process of figuring the history out.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask an historian. We're sitting here, we're living through a pandemic, we're doing digital programming, otherwise we'd be in person, having this conversation together. What are the most important lessons we shouldn't lose sight of from the Spanish flu of 1918? Something you used to teach to your students, no longer do. As we're living through COVID-19, what are some of the lessons that you see from history that we shouldn't lose sight of right now?
I mean, the one is pretty obvious. Leadership matters. Leadership is important. When I think about 1918, this is this is not the first time that the federal administration has failed us during a pandemic. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson did not publicly mention the pandemic once. He never spoke about it. It was almost as if it wasn't happening. So if you, and back then you generally didn't see or hear a president. You generally, read about what they said in the paper or something like that. Never once. He focused on World War I, the war effort, and never publicly acknowledged it. So that was a massive failure of leadership on Woodrow Wilson's part. And because there was no real direction coming from the federal government, it was almost like the states and health departments were sort of, going at it themselves, which sounds pretty familiar. And in Erie, we had a pretty interesting public health director back then, Dr. I think it was Dr. Wright. I don't want to forget, but I think it was Dr. Wright. I wrote about him. I should remember that. And, he tried his best, but we still had 504 people die in Erie during that pandemic. And the lesson that I find even more interesting, this part I didn't put in my story, but when they opened everything back up, it was partially because the business leaders, of course, had pressured them. They're like, we have to open back up. We're going to go out of business. And back then, the public health director had a lot of power, where now not so much. And when they were going to close down again, the business leaders basically organized and said, no, it's not going to happen. So we didn't close down, which led to that was when we were at like 200 and some deaths. So it led to another 300 deaths in Erie because we didn't close back down when we probably should have. But I don't know. I don't want to be the person that's making the decision. How do you weigh lives against the economy? To me, I want to say you have to save lives no matter what. But if you don't have the federal government or whoever taking care of people and taking care of businesses and making sure they're not going to lose their business or lose their home, then you're ruining somebody's life in another way. So yeah, we just need to make sure that we have a captain, running the ship instead of just having a bunch of crew members arguing with each other on how to do it. And see Pennsylvania compared to Florida and Texas and
even look at where New York is now and how
right.
things have changed in New York, how things have changed in New Jersey, and how Arizona, which was once a great example, being held up it's a very different story now. So when the leadership of 50, 51, 52, if we're counting territories and so on and so forth, compared to leadership of one, what a great lesson. Hopefully history will teach us a little bit better right now. We need to learn that. But so if you're hosting a dinner party and you can bring any 4 guests from history, you probably get this all the time as an historian, but who's at your dinner party? Who are getting the invitations? Those 4 people. Who do you want to hang out with?
I mean, I want to hang out with a lot of people. I'm going to stick to American history because that'll make it a little easier. John Brown. That's an easy one for me. Fascinating dude, and I'm really, really happy to see sort of like the public opinion on him shift towards, a more positive view. James Baldwin, love the writing of James Baldwin, and I could just watch his videos talking on YouTube all day. Sitting Bull's always blown my mind, and just what he did in the the late 1800s, and being able to go to DC and kind of live in these 2 different worlds as an advocate for his people, and also basically rebelling. Well, not rebelling. He saw it as fighting against another nation that was trying to overtake his. And then I don't know. I'd probably want like Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth as the 4th one to round it out. I know Tubman knew John Brown, so that would be kind of interesting if they were sitting on the table together and hear them talk.
Just let them take over the conversation at the end.
I'd just sit there. Yeah, like I have no interest. People are like, I'd go talk to Adolf Hitler. And I'm like, what am I going to learn from him? I don't need to learn anything from him. I want to sit there and talk to people I can absorb their knowledge and their wisdom from. And yeah, for sure.
I don't have time to roll through each one of those excellent choices, but I will say one of the things that stuck with me for a while is a week or so ago, maybe longer, I'm losing track in pandemic time, but the Washington Post had a post that was an excerpt from Ken Burns' documentary on the Statue of Liberty, in which he asked James Baldwin, what is liberty? And it's such a poignant response, and very appropriate now. A documentary from 1985 to revisit that, and Ken Burns has some great commentary on today. So I encourage people for that. But excited to hear you mention James Baldwin. I would.
Well, and speaking of, if you have Netflix, I think they just put on the documentary about James Baldwin. It's called "I Am Not Your Negro," and I highly, highly recommend that. It really dives into James Baldwin and a lot of the stuff that was going on throughout his life.
So if you could do a one-on-one, is it James Baldwin? If you could pick anybody from history and sit down and do a one-on-one interview for the Erie Reader with this one person, would it be James Baldwin? Would it be somebody different? And I'll give you the limiter you give yourself, American history.
I'd probably want it to be somebody actually we don't have footage of, because, I can sit and watch James Baldwin interviews all the time. I'd love to sit down with John Brown, of course, or Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, everybody knows her name, but man, most people don't know her story. It's wild, absolutely wild. And, though, the one person I would really like to, there's a person in Erie's history that I don't know much about, but his name was Blow Bladen, and there's a place called Bladen Road named after him over by Cherry Street Extension. And he was one of the first settlers that were non-native, at least in the Erie region, and he was a former slave that bought he and his family's freedom, and he came here and settled here in 1795 when Erie was established. I'd love to just sit down and talk with him and hear what Erie was like in 1795, and about his life experiences, and just get like an everyday regular person's, not that he was an everyday regular person, he had a remarkable story, but that's probably actually who I would do if I could do it one-on-one, somebody a little less predictable.
So somebody says, history sucks, it's not worth it, it's boring, it's stupid. What's your quick reply?
I say, oh my God, I get this from students all the time at the beginning of the school year. I say, yeah, it sucks, and that's what makes it so interesting. Like, we need to be aware of why history sucks, because we don't want, the future to suck too. And then, that's kind of like the hook to get them laughing a little bit, but really I just try to tell them history isn't names and dates. It doesn't have to be boring. I had an amazing professor at Edinburgh, Dr. Joseph Joey Lathe. Anybody that went to Edinburgh before he died of cancer probably took a class with him. And he basically said that we're all just asking the same question. Who are we and where do we fit in? And really, that's what history is. It's our shared experience. It's our collective experience. It's not learning what happened, like I told you. It's learning how what happened affected people. People that look like us, people that don't look like us, people of different genders, of different sexualities, different religions. And if you like stories, you like history. There's a reason why I try to write my stories as narratives. Stories are as old as humanity itself, or at least as old as language. And, I guess that's kind of my 1 minute pitch.
That's a great 1 minute pitch. I'm going to ask you for another 1 minute pitch, which is, how do we make sure we get the telling of history better? When we tell it better, I mean more fully accurate, that we acknowledge the sins of our past better, that we don't try to obscure them. We don't try to either erase them for the history book or minimalize them to one sentence, but we head on look at full history and tell it to ourselves better. How do we do that? What gives you hope for that?
It's difficult because history is weaponized and politicized. It always has been. It'll continue to be. You look at the Confederate statue argument, and you would think, like, anybody that thought critically about it for more than a minute or two would be able to understand this is why we're taking them down. But of course, it's all been politicized. But for much of the United States, really, history has been told by people that look like me, white dudes. And it's not that there weren't a lot of white dudes that did good and valuable history, but if you're only getting the perspective of white men, frankly, there's going to be gaps in that knowledge and gaps in that perspective. Even today, most tenured history positions are white men, and that is changing. I think now it's something like 50% of history graduates are women, somewhere around 50%. And you see a lot more historians who are Black now that are actually, not that they didn't exist before, but they're now actually getting positions and getting book deals. Historians who are Hispanic, LGBTQ, you're actually seeing those. And if you follow the hashtag Twitterstorians, which on Twitter is just a hashtag that historians use, you'll see that now we're starting to get a much broader perspective on history. And I think that's the only way that we can really get a broader and bigger picture of our collective past. And like you said, we have to acknowledge our passions, evils, and or our nation's evils and sins, rather. And until we fully embrace that and embrace historians of different backgrounds and ethnicities and religions and so forth, I think we'll always have an incomplete picture. The great thing about history, though, is it never ends. It's always open to new interpretations, and studying historiography is something I would recommend to everybody, how our views of history have changed over time.
Well, I think that's such a great note to end on. As we're out of time here for this conversation, but want to encourage people to follow along for that, because I couldn't agree more. I think a chorus full of just tenors or just altos or just sopranos or just baritones or just basses doesn't make a chorus. So the more people we have contributing to it, the better we understand the song of ourselves and who we are and how we live.
I'm going to steal that one. That was good.
All right. It's all yours. You can have it. We're sharing it here. But Mr. Jonathan Burdick, historian, teacher, writer, thank you for taking the time for this conversation, a great one for Jefferson programming here today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate it. Thank you, for sure.
And all of you watching along at home, either the live broadcast or later broadcast, thank you for tuning in. We are grateful for you for conversations like this. Jonathan, for folks looking to connect with you and follow along to learn about Twitterstorians and all of the cool stuff that's happening on Rust and Dirt on Twitter and elsewhere, where should we point those people?
So I try to post the same thing on 3 different platforms, just based on what people are, what they use. So there's a Rust and Dirt Twitter. It's just at Rust Dirt. Somebody stole Rusty and Dirt from me before I could get it. On Instagram, it's Rust and Dirt. And then on Facebook, which I just started using Facebook less than a year ago for this, so it doesn't have a huge following on Facebook. But that is you just search Rust and Dirt and it should come up. So those are the 3 main ways to tap in. You can message me on there if you ever have any questions or, want me to explore something. I get people that request hey, can you look into this for me? And I can't do it for everybody, but I usually get a kick out of that. So feel free.
And one of the last parting questions we have coming in is folks are wondering when you're going to offer an online history class for them. So hopefully soon, I can say, or at least we'll gather for another conversation, but tune into those platforms in case you're not already offering an online history class. Are you teaching us online, Jonathan? Can we subscribe?
I might be teaching my students online, but that remains to be seen.
Well, we'll find out. Hopefully have you back here soon to the Jefferson digital program again for great conversations like this and to really be able to look at our history now. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programming, as well as publications, please visit our website, jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.
Thanks.